Hi everyone, this is Henry, and today I'll be presenting to you on fractals for my final 258 presentation. So what are fractals? Fractals are a type of mathematical shape that are indefinitely complex. Um, in plainest terms, essentially it's a pattern that repeats itself forever, and every part of a fractal looks similar to the whole image of the fractal. So that's that. So where did fractals originate from? Well, it was the term fractals was coined by the mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, or, and fractal essentially in English, sorry, fractal in English translates to the Latin word fractus, which means broken or fractured, because as I kind of said, fractal components, uh, sorry, fractal components are broken up into many different components, and it's kind of like repeated an indefinite kind of loop in a way. So that's that. Now, here's an example of fractals, which you might see is really familiar. We actually did this for our CS 187 project called, I believe the project was related to recursions. So essentially, you have from left, right, top, down, you have the um, coach or the cock curve, you have the snowflake, you have a tree. Then you have triangles, right? Within triangles, and then you have squares within squares. Essentially, what these are basic examples of fractals. Um, you can see the overall image, and then things are broken up into the same image over and over again. Essentially, it's the overall image. So fractals occur in nature. An example of this is a tree, right? You start with one long trunk. Um, Trunks are broken up into smaller wooden parts called branches, right? And then branches are broken up into further smaller parts until you reach the stem and then the leaves, right? So that's essentially what fractals are in a way in nature. It's everywhere. We're gonna go through a few more fractal in nature examples, and essentially one note is that um, this all re- this tree kind of relates to fractal curves because it's a mathematical curve that helps retain shape, a general pattern of irregularity, essentially from big to small in this case. Yeah, of course, the heart, the circulatory system. You have blood vessels. You start with the main big ones, the arteries and the veins, and then um, connected to them are smaller channels of blood supply lines, tunnels in a way. And then, it goes further down into capillaries, which are very small, that are connected to cells and whatnot. So that's another example of how those occur in nature. And then, of course, the wonderful snowflake, right? In this case, um, in a way, it does go from big to small. You can think about it that way. You have the main component, which are the three the three lines in a way. So you have the slanted right to left, and then left to right, and then a side to side kind of slant. And then each of these these main branches broke up into smaller branches, and then to create kind of like this kind of branch, right? Which is like halfway through the main branch. And then they're also further broken down into um, smaller and smaller pieces. So that hopefully that gives an idea of what fractals are and how they occur all over the place in nature. Uh, so the next thing we're going to talk about is fractals in math, because there's a lot involved. For this instance, we're going to be talking about geometric math, specifically geometric shapes and polynomial shapes. If you think about polynomial shape, you can play around with like the edges, you can play around with the space, right? So this is an example of an iteration where on top you take the edge and then you break it down into um, subparts, and then for the bottom you have space, right? That you can break down into smaller parts as well of the same shape. In this instance, a cube turns to 9 subcubes. A triangle turns into 4 subtriangles, and then this kind of iteration keeps going on and on from left to right. We'll only show 5 iterations here, and you can see there's a pretty dramatic difference between iteration 0 and iteration 4. Right? But one key thing to note is that you may realize iteration 3, 4, and 5 kind of look similar in a way. And that's kind of like the pattern of fractals, is that it's a continuous kind of uh, design. So essentially, if you have the 6th iteration of, what the 5th iteration was, and then broke it up into its subparts based off the rule, you have really, really similar fractal designs. And I guess that's part of why it's kind of fancy and cool, is because as iterations move on, it kind of stays the same in a way to the naked eye, of course. So that's fractals in geometric math. We're also going to talk about fractals in algebraic math. So this image is from the Mendelbrot set, essentially the founder of fractals, the person who coined the term fractals. He created this kind of set with the formula so the formula essentially is like f of n plus 1 is equal to f of n squared plus c. And I mean, this image looks pretty cool in a way. It's kind of awkward in a way, but you realize it's kind of some sort of a pattern of not a circle maybe, but something spherical, something circular that keeps getting repeated itself on and on and on and on. And that's a pattern you recognize. It looks pretty cool, but it's kind of weird as well. So that's kind of like not the purpose, but that's kind of like the general trends of fractals. To create this image, it's very, very complex. There are hundreds of thousands, potentially millions of calculations in order to create just this image alone. And this definitely cannot be done in hand. You could try, but it'll take a lot of manpower. So of course, the efficient way is technology, right? We'll talk more about that later on, more about fractals with technology and how it relates together. But essentially, that's how it's done. Fractals essentially starts with a mathematical equation, essentially, and it uses technology to kind of generate that kind of image in a way. So the next thing we're going to talk about is, of course, math, but more of a dimensional math, kind of calculus-based, multi-dimensional in a way. There's 4 dimensions. There's 0D, 1D, 2D, and 3D. And fractals also exist for this purpose, or not purpose, but these multi-dimensions can be used to create fractals. And what is very interesting is that like these fractals in multi-dimensional space can actually be created what's known as fractal terrains or landscape. The name is pretty self-explanatory. Essentially, it's using math and fractals to create like 3D landscaping and terrain kind of image, right? So on the left, you have like the abstract understanding of multi-dimensions in math, and then on the right is the more realistic generated sort of multi-dimensional math that is applied with fractals. And it's less abstract, it's more meaningful. From this image, you clearly see that it's like a mountain. And you will realize this is kind of hard to do by hand. This is definitely done by technology. You can see that it's used everywhere today. If you open up Google Maps, you will see this when you do the Earth view with like, it shows you kind of the terrains, the mountains and whatnot. It's also shown in maps. You can see that in maps where it's like, oh, the The closer the lines are, it looks more mountainous or valley-ish or plain in a way. And that's all done by fractal computations using multidimensional mathematical equations. So that's that. I believe that's it for math. Next thing we're going to talk about is fractals with technology. Now, when I started this kind of exploration of fractals, I kind of started with the perspective of fractal art, but I kind of check this a little bit more to include everything. So um, it is said that technology helped explore fractal art because of the advanced calculation capabilities of using technology compared to doing that by hand and doing manual computations. Um, and fractal art can be generated iteratively by solving polynomial equations. Um, and if you think about it, right, if you use technology to generate fractal art or anything that fractal related, what can you do with it with this technology? Like, how can you use technology to your advances to your advantage? You're saving time, right? But it also allows you to like do other stuff, such as zooming in and out to see more granular details in a fractal art that you might not be visible that might not be visible to the naked eye if you're doing it by hand. Um, so that's the kind of the advancedness and the incredibly cool thing about fractals and how it's being used with technology, um, or how these technologies used to help generate fractals. And there are programs out there to create fractals simply um, by using a computer and API and stuff like that, which makes it incredibly awesome. Um, but this is the relationship between fractals and technology is kind of bidirectional. We kind of talked about how technology is used to generate kind of fractal art, but the concept of fractal is also being used in technology. Specifically, what's called as well, a specific example of this would be called fractal antenna technology, and essentially, um, there's a limitation to the performance of traditional antennas, right? But scientists have figured out that if they play around with fractal like copper and connectivity in an antenna, um, they can save space or they or minimize space and or increase surface area, which is pretty cool because more surface area is needed for certain types of connections. And essentially that's how it's being kind of used, at least in technology. So there's like a directional relationship in that. So to conclude, really, I just want to say how this relates to GEB. When you throughout the book, there'll be a lot of artwork by Eschler that kind of shows a repetition. You have like the fish that has repetition with different coloring and whatnot. And these kind of repetition made me explore repetition art. And fortunately, I found Fractal and kind of draw my attention to it and kind of made me do this for the final presentation because Fractal essentially has repetition, not and like it's a repetition that's chaotic and irregular because the overall image looks pretty cool and abstract in a way, and there's patterns to it, but at some point there's some weirdness to it that you can't really kind of decipher and explain. Um, and it's also related to algorithms, right? So one of the homework assignment that we did was reading about like how uh, tortoise and uh, Mr. A was going to different dimensional space, the different tiers of space and whatnot, and we kind of wrote a homework assignment. We had a homework assignment about writing methods, right? Well, so that's all computational. That's all algorithms in the book. And unfortunately, fractals require algorithms and computers because of the calculation potential in it and efficiency in it, all that sort of fun stuff. Um, So that's that. That pretty much concludes my fractal presentation. There's much more stuff online to talk about fractals that I couldn't fit into like a 10-minute presentation. But feel free to do some Google searching. There are a lot of visual fractal art out there that looks pretty cool. That's funky. You can even generate your own using some fractal art APIs. There's softwares out there to generate your own, and it's some fancy stuff. Yeah, that's my talk on fractals. Thank you so much. And good luck on the finals, everyone.